Welcome to the LDN radio show, brought to you by the LDN Research Trust. I'm your host, Linda Elsegood. I have an exciting lineup of guest speakers who are LDN experts in their field. We will be discussing low-dose naltrexone and its many uses in autoimmune diseases, cancers, etc. You're invited to join us on air, asking your questions by calling in on the local rate phone numbers in the UK and the US, which can be found on ldnradio.org. Thank you for joining us. Today we're joined by Dr. Jarrad Younger, and I know this is an interview that you've all been excited and interested to hear. Thank you for joining us today, Jarrad. Murray Avenue Apothecary is a compounding pharmacy boutique specialising in gentle hormone restoration therapy, acetyl glutathione, pet compounding, lab naturals non-toxic skincare, hair restoration, one-to-one consultations and more. They are Pittsburgh's only green pharmacy and proud compounder of LDN therapies through the LDN Trust. Learn more at maapgh.com. Thank you for joining me, Jarrad.
Hello.
Could you tell us what led you down the route to become a research scientist? What was your goal when you were at school? What did you want to be?
Very long story. I guess you can stop me if it's too long. Well, I guess I started in undergraduate. I knew I was interested in health, and I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to get into. And I went to a psychology conference, and a researcher named Sheldon Cohen did a presentation on. He did a study where he brought a bunch of people to a hotel, and he took concentrated cold virus and squirted it up 1,000 people's noses. And he wanted to see who got sick and who didn't. And he found that the people who were the most stressed out in their daily lives were significantly more likely to get sick. And that was the first study where they had objective proof that showed that our mind and our bodies are very importantly linked. And it got me so excited. So I was like, I'm going to go to grad school and research this stuff. So I went to a grad school in psychology as well and fell in with a group of researchers who did hypnosis research. And so I don't think anyone knows this story. They don't usually associate me with hypnosis. But the mentor's name was Mike Nash. He's still there at University of Tennessee. And it was really amazing. I mean, we all did this ourselves. We hypnotized hundreds and hundreds of people and showed that for some people it's amazingly powerful, that if you can control some aspects of the mind, you can really, really help some things in the body, the most important being pain. And so I got really fascinated in pain, but the psychological approaches didn't work for everyone. And so when I went to Arizona for a postdoc, I started to do neuro-imaging. I wanted to know when someone is in a lot of pain, where in the circuitry is that disruption occurring? Because what I want to do, instead of using psychological techniques to help them, I want to fix the original problem. That's even better. And that led me to go to Stanford in California to kind of perfect the neuroimaging and to test different drugs. And so then I started getting more into medical. So it kind of evolved over time, over about 15 years, seeing the impact of particularly pain on people, seeing it really destroy people's lives. And I've seen it in my own family and wanting to fix that problem of chronic pain. And that's led me down this path of neuroimaging and neuroinflammation and testing novel drugs to come up with something that's not addictive, because I've seen what the opioid medications do to people as well, and we could talk about that later if you wanted to. But looking at the problem, especially in the U.S., how big that problem is, I wanted to come up with solutions that had very low side effects and still did the job.
Okay. So you weren't a little boy that wanted to be a pilot or a train driver. You were interested in medicine.
Yeah, I mean, if we go way, God, I remember telling when my grandmother asked me if I was going to be a doctor when I was probably 5, I told her I was going to paint the lines on streets instead. And I think I said that. I just wanted to make her mad. I was trying to think of the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But, I was originally, I was thinking way back. I'm sure I went through the normal pilot and astronaut stuff, but none of that stuff is serious. So I think it pretty much you start seriously thinking about it maybe college, and then I had a brief stint where I was going to do FBI stuff, investigation, but I found that the psychology and health classes were a lot more interesting to me than the political science classes. So I switched over to health psych and have stayed in it since then.
And I know you're at the University of Alabama now, but what has gone before that? What did you start with your career once you were qualified?
Yeah, so the tracing, so the different institutions I've kind of done this almost like a circle in the United States. So it started off in Tennessee. That's where I did my undergrad, my grad school training. So that's where I got my PhD at the University of Tennessee. So then went from there to the desert, which is in Arizona. That's Tempe, Arizona State University. So that's way over in West United States. And then went further. I was trying to get to the ocean, to the Pacific Ocean. So kept going west and got all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So was at Stanford, Palo Alto, California for almost 10 years. So stayed out there a really long time. And now just 3 years ago, circled all the way back pretty close to where I began. So now at Alabama. And so now I'm about a 4-hour drive from where my parents are and where I grew up. So pretty good circle there.
So is the weather colder now you're east rather than west?
No, it's a lot hotter because I'm pretty far south now. So Alabama is in this, I think it's considered a subtropical climate. So it's very wet and it's very, very hot. It's a bit too hot if you ask me. Other people like it, but to me it's pretty warm. So California was very temperate. So everything's within about 10 degrees all year round. So you get, when you live in California for a while, you get pretty wimpy, I guess, because you never experience any climate extreme. So I've had to try to adjust. I hide inside for about 6 months out of the year now because the summer lasts so long. So it's pretty warm. Yeah.
And we know that you did some exciting studies while you were at Stanford. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, there's a lot. So one thing I do a lot of studies and do a lot at the same time. So, I mean, I could certainly pull out a few that just were kind of generally interesting. And if there's other ones you want to talk about, we can do that. Or if there's a particular topic, because we've done so many. It's really, I mean, the focus has been pain and fatigue and these kind of chronic disorders, but I try to tackle it in a lot of different ways. One of the studies that got a lot of attention from Stanford is we did a study about how love or romantic feelings can reduce pain. I don't know if you ever saw that one, but it was a neuro-imaging study, and so we put people who are in a new relationship into the scanner, into the MRI, the brain scanner, and we kind of burn their hand with a thermode. It's specially designed not to cause damage, but it hurts a lot. And then we showed people pictures of the person they're in love with. So it came up on little goggles while they're in the scanner. And we found that when they were looking at pictures of the person they're in love with, their experience of pain was reduced by about half, which is quite powerful. I mean, that's equivalent to, opioid painkiller medications in a lot of cases. But then we could look inside the brain at the same time and see how that was happening. And what we saw is that when someone was looking at a picture of the person they're in a relationship with, it activated these deep structures we call the reward system. And these are activated anytime you see or you eat something that's very, very rewarding. If you win the lottery and you get millions dollars, pounds, that area will light up significantly. And every time that happens, it sends messages down to your spinal cord that cuts off the incoming pain messages. And so we could actually see that happening. We could see the reward system activating, and that's why the pain was being reduced. So very cool to be able to visualize that and see it at work. And it actually is applicable because that gives us regions of the brain that we can then target with neuromodulatory techniques and actually potentially teach people how to control those brain regions so they can reduce their own pain without having to use medication. So
that's amazing.
One of the studies we did, and it worked out really well. Got a lot of attention, but there's so many more we could talk about as well. So just let me know. I could talk about studies.
Please.
All day.
Yes, just tell us some more. That's really interesting.
I didn't know. So, did you want to go into low-dose naltrexone, or can I save that for later?
Yeah,
or
you can save that for later. Yes, please.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. What's another really good one that we did? I think the big question with chronic pain is trying to find a way to objectively. So the big problem is when someone comes and says that they're in pain, how do you know they're telling the truth? So if you're a physician and someone says, I'm 10 out of 10 pain, it's as bad as it can get, and they're grimacing, and you suspect that person may be trying to get medications, like opioid medications, how do you know if they're telling the truth or not? So one of the things we did at Stanford is to try to develop brain scans that you could put someone in the scanner and know whether or not they're in pain based on what those brain scans look like. Now, that's a very, very difficult thing to do, and no one's been able to achieve it 100%. You kind of call it a pain meter or, a pain classification. But if someone figures out how to do that, that will be very, very powerful. So I think our group, this is under Sean Mackey at Stanford. He was director of the pain division, or chief of the pain division, actually got really close. We very quickly, using only brain scans and feeding that through an algorithm, we could see whether or not someone was in pain or not and predict that with a very high degree of accuracy. And now some other people have taken that up to about 98%. So we're now at the point where we can tell if you're in pain or not through a brain scan, and now other groups are trying to work on, now can we tell how much pain you're in? That would be the ultimate. So what's really amazing is we're getting closer to objectively identifying pain. Whether we'll get all the way there and be able to use it clinically, we're not sure. It's very, very complicated, but at least we can get somewhat there. And so that's a lot of the stuff I was working on, is developing those techniques to just scan the brain and then have the computer say, yes, based on this activity in this region, this person's probably experiencing pain right now. And so kind of did some groundbreaking stuff on that. And now other people have taken that over and taking it further.
Well, just imagine insurance companies when people are saying they've had a car accident, my back is so bad and I can't work, I can't move. And to have a scan that could show, well, actually, they're not in pain. It's just something they're saying. They would love it, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and they would. And, doctors, so legal stuff, insurance, physicians. As you know, in the United States, much, much more so than in the UK, the drug-seeking thing with opioids is a huge problem. And, if somebody's legitimately in pain and you get that wrong, you think they're just trying to get drugs from you, opioids, then that person is suffering needlessly. But the problem is what you just mentioned is also the kind of caveat, and why a lot of the scientists kind of play it very conservatively, because in order for an insurance company or hospital to make a decision based on the scan, it needs to be 100% accurate, because if you get that wrong, it's a really bad thing. And so you'll always hear us we're excited when it works, but, what if one person out of 100 has chronic pain that doesn't show up in the scan for whatever reason? It's somewhere else. It's in the spinal cord, maybe. We wouldn't want to get that wrong, and so it's going to be many, many years, if ever, before we trust a scan more than the person. So right now, it's whatever if you say you're in pain, we generally believe you, because we don't have anything that is more accurate than the person's self-report. So it's not perfect, but it would be nice. It'd be a cool thing to have, but we have to be very cautious and go very slowly to get there.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? We'll keep an eye on that in the future. So what other interesting things have you done?
So let me think of some of the more recent things. The big thing we're trying to do right now is, so you probably know that my particular model of LDN is that it's reducing central inflammation. So a lot of our work has to do with central inflammation, and we're trying to develop a scan that we can put you in the scanner, and within 20 minutes or 30 minutes, we can know whether you have brain inflammation or not. Currently, there's nothing that exists like that. There's some experimental research scans, but they're not perfect, and so we're trying to develop something that's clinically valid. One of the things we're doing, I don't know if we ever talked about the brain temperature scan, but that's something that we're pursuing very aggressively right now. So we're taking people with chronic pain, chronic fatigue, rheumatoid arthritis, traumatic brain injury, all these things that we think involve the brain, and we bring them to the scanner, and we can scan the brain and we can get temperature all throughout the brain. So just like someone takes temperature in their body to know if they have a fever, we can do the scan in the brain to know if they have basically elevated temperature, which would indicate neuroinflammation. And so far we don't have a lot of people run through it, but so far it looks pretty good, where people with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia have elevated brain temperature, and so we think that means there's neuroinflammation. So the next step, which I can't talk a lot about, but I can just throw a little teaser out there, is to use a technique called PET, which is Positron Emission Tomography, that will allow us to see if immune cells from the body are breaking through to the brain and causing inflammation. So our blood-brain barrier is supposed to keep all our peripheral immune cells in the body and outside the brain. I think in diseases like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and certainly multiple sclerosis, animal models say this happens. Those peripheral immune cells, those T cells and B cells, break into the brain and cause just pure havoc. In fact, that may be what drives these disorders. And so once we can confirm that, that would give us a really good objective test for knowing when someone's blood-brain barrier has broken down and those immune cells are breaking through and causing problems. So that gives us new targets for treatments.
That's really interesting.
So stuff like that are new. We do lots of clinical trials. We can talk about that sometime. We have another thing I'm trying to work on is another test to know. We're trying to find out why people have fibromyalgia, and what we think is that they have an immune system that's basically hypersensitized. So if I were to so every day we walk around, we're exposed to low-level bacteria, maybe some viruses. Most of those don't cause an infection, but I think that people with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome have an immune system that's so sensitive that these really, really little triggers end up causing a big response in them. And so we're just now starting a study where we're going to inject people with a substance that tricks the immune system into thinking that there's an infection. But we're giving it at a super, super low level. So the level is so low that a healthy person won't even notice it. So we'll inject that with healthy people. They're going to stay in the hospital all day, and we think they'll be like, did you inject me with saline? I don't feel any different. But we think the fibromyalgia patients, when they're given that injection, will have a immune response, and they'll also feel sick. So that sounds like a bad thing to do. Like, why would we want to make fibromyalgia patients feel sicker? But if it works, and we only need to do it on about 10 people to see if it works, it's going to be huge, because if we can measure an abnormal immune response from patients, that'll almost clearly tell us that their immune system is hypersensitized and dysregulated, and that will definitely lead to some good treatments. So important for us to do. We waited for 2 years for the government to release the new batch of this stuff, because they're the only ones who can distribute it. And finally, they gave it to us about 2 weeks ago, and so now we're going to start recruiting for that study and seeing if we can figure out fibromyalgia, which we really need to do.
Exactly. I mean, The people that I've met with fibromyalgia, the pain that they can experience is unbelievable. It's not just the pain, is it? It's the fibro fog and the fatigue and all the other elements that go with it. So to be able to treat that would be amazing. We'll just have a quick break and then we'll be straight back. Murray Avenue Apothecary is a compounding pharmacy boutique specialising in gentle hormone restoration therapy, acetyl glutathione, pet compounding, Lab Naturals non-toxic skincare, hair restoration, one-to-one consultations and more. They are Pittsburgh's only green pharmacy and proud compounder of LDN therapies through the LDN Trust. Learn more at maapgh.com. Welcome back. The time has gone really quickly. So perhaps we could move on now to the trials and studies that you've done with LDN.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Let me just talk about what I've done to date.
That would be good.
The best way?
Yes, please.
Sure. I wish I could say we've done a whole lot more. I wish we would have done studies on hundreds and hundreds of people, but we have gotten the ball rolling, which I think is the most important thing. So when it comes to a drug, and there are other drugs I test, but low-dose naltrexone has been the most interesting. Where I come in is I usually try to test things that haven't been tested before, and they're usually pilot studies. And then if it looks interesting, I'll run a larger version of that. And if that looks good, I publish that. I don't, people who listen kind of watch our Facebook page and newsletter and stuff. I try to get out information as much as I can, as fast as I can. I don't want to keep it to myself. I'm not interested in starting companies or anything. So I try to get that information out to everyone. And if it looks good, usually some companies come by and may pick that up and may run with it and turn it into a commercial product. And that's absolutely fine, because once it's commercialized, more physicians feel okay prescribing it. So that's one of the goals. But at the point when I show that it works and the company takes over, usually my job is done. So that's what's happened with LDN. Is I started off, two things happened at the same time. I'm trying to figure out fibromyalgia, and I'm looking on the internet probably about 10 years ago, and I keep seeing people talking about low-dose naltrexone that have been using it. And, I've got a pretty good eye for separating signal from noise. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of saw that this was popping up more frequently than I would expect if it was just kind of random noise or, something. There was something here. At the same time, somebody sent me a couple of articles in animal models showing that low-dose naltrexone decreases activity in the microglia cells that I was thinking was involved in fibromyalgia. And so when those two things happened at the same time, like, okay, I think I know what's going on here, but let's test it. So I did the first 10-person study. That's very, very small, just to see, because, clinical trials are expensive to run. So ran, it was single blind, so not even a strongly designed study. So the patients didn't know what they were getting when, but I knew. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to know if it had any chance of working. At that time, it had never been tested in research in fibromyalgia, and it worked really well. And this is a published study from a while back. I think, basically 7 out of the 10 participants, 7 out of 10 women, had a great response to LDN. And so that was plenty enough for me to go, wow, this is way more than what we'd expect from placebo. So then I got some money from the American Fibromyalgia Syndrome Association to do a 30-person study, and that showed the exact same thing. That one was better controlled. It was double-blind, so even I didn't know what people were getting when until the study was done, and the same response rate. So about 65 to 70% response rate. And what I call response rate is a pretty significant reduction of symptoms. So they had to have their pain reduced and their fatigue had to go down, or their sleep had to improve. So looked like a really good response, certainly better than most other treatments that I have seen published. And I noticed it was the same response rate that Jill Smith was reporting with low-dose naltrexone in Crohn's disease, about 65-70%. So it looked pretty good to me. At that point, after I published that, I know that more than one company was pursuing low-dose naltrexone as a commercial product. And so at that point, I kind of drew back on doing efficacy studies because I don't want to duplicate work that's being done elsewhere, at least in fibromyalgia. But we have done some small studies. I can't talk about them fully. One of them is going to be published probably in the next month, where we tried to figure out why does low-dose naltrexone work. And so did a small study at Stanford right before we moved to Alabama, where we tracked people's blood every 3 days while they were taking low-dose naltrexone. And we saw that several pro-inflammatory cytokines were drastically reduced while they were taking LDN. So we see things, I throw out one like interleukin-6, which is something that engages your immune system. We saw a very nice decrease over time that we attribute to the drug. So we're just kind of adding to the information that low-dose naltrexone is a novel anti-inflammatory drug. It doesn't work like aspirin, other drugs, but it does impact the immune system in a positive way. And that information is really helpful because a lot of times when I talk to professionals about LDN, they're like, how does that work? It doesn't make sense. But if you can show them that change in the blood chemistry, then it starts to make a lot more sense.
Mm. Oh, I've forgotten what I was going to say now. So from all the trials... Yeah, the trials and studies you've done, if I can just interrupt you for a minute, have you found the question that we're always being asked is, should you take it at night? Should you take it in the morning? Does it make any difference?
Yeah.
Some doctors will say, take it at night, but if it causes sleep disturbance, take it in the morning. What is the scientific answer that you have learned from your research?
Yeah. So we have to remember the origins. So the canon of LDN says take it at night before bedtime. Mm-hmm. Most people probably are aware that came from a specific hypothesis about how LDN works, which is LDN antagonizes or blocks the opioid system only for a short period of time, and then it causes an upregulation of opioid production. And so that theory of low-dose naltrexone mechanism is that if you block it before bedtime, that blockade works for a few hours, and then while you're asleep, when you hit about 3 o'clock in the morning, that's the time when your body will kind of upregulate the opioid system. The antagonist stops working, and you get this huge rebound. And so the idea was block it shortly, then while you're asleep, your body produces a lot of opioids, and then those opioids will help the pain the next day. So the importance of taking it at night, really, it's only critical if that's the reason it works. That is not what I research with low-dose naltrexone. So in my model, it doesn't matter what time you take it. And in fact, in our studies, if someone has problems with insomnia, we just move them to the morning. And I can only speak to the subjects that we've run, but I never noticed that it made a huge difference in our patients. So I don't know if that conflicts with physicians. I mean, there's some physicians out there who have used it in hundreds, if not thousands, of people. So they may know better, but from my limited observations, the time of day, morning versus night, didn't seem to matter. In fact, a lot of people preferred to take it in the morning because it did disturb sleep a little bit at the first. So
I would say that...
Again, from limited data, I would say it doesn't matter. Yeah.
But from the experience that I've learned from prescribers, as time has gone on, they have realised that it doesn't really matter. And I think 9 out of 10 will actually say, you can take it. But then there are some of the listeners who will say they've listened to old videos and things where you must take it at night. But I think that information has been superseded as time has gone on, that, it isn't essential to take it at night. Now, I know you're a research scientist and you're not a prescriber, but scientifically, if you could answer this question. There are a few doctors that will prescribe LDN for CFSME twice a day, morning and night. Have you done any research, or have you any thoughts on that scientifically?
It's perfectly plausible that so what's happening right now is we have enough evidence. Let's just take fibromyalgia, ME/CFS or fibromyalgia. Enough evidence suggests that this drug is doing something that's beneficial. The next question is, as you're bringing up, what's the best dosage? You mentioned what time of day and how many times a day, or should you even take it every other day? So these are all, none of those things have been tested in a research protocol. So the caveat is we can't know for sure until we actually try those things and objectively measure the response. However, science is not the only piece of information. I mean, information coming from physicians is definitely valid, important information. And so I'm getting information all the time about dosage with, clearly 4.5 milligrams is not the magic number, which, it used to be everything was about 4.5 milligrams or maybe 3, but now we're seeing that some patients seem to do great on 1. Some patients may need to take 6 milligrams or even 7.5. I've even heard a few times 9 milligrams, which is still pretty low, but, it's almost double 4.5. Mm-hmm. And so more than once a day dosing might work better than once a day dosing, especially now that we have a more informed model about how it works. That once a day dosing may make less sense. However, I don't know without running the study if that's going to translate into better efficacy, but I don't think there's much harm in trying. If a physician was asking me if that's something to try, I would just say if anyone was going to do that, they need to just carefully track how they do. Start off with once a day, see what kind of response you get, then switch over to twice a day and continue to monitor your symptoms and see if it does better. Because the truth is really the only thing that matters to a patient is does it work for them or not. And so sometimes what happens with thousands of people in research may have nothing to do with how you're going to respond. So I think it's worth trying. There's certainly no danger I can think of with taking a low dose of naltrexone twice a day. So I would say if someone said their physician recommended, I would say, yeah, go ahead and try it and see what happens. I don't know if it would make a huge difference or not, but it could.
But maybe that's a study or a trial you can do later in the future.
So, yeah, and that's the big thing for me is, okay, so we get lots of questions like that. We mentioned some of them. Another huge question is, can I take it with a little bit of opioids? Like I take 1 hydrocodone a day. Is the naltrexone going to block that? And we don't know. I think theoretically they probably could be taken at the same time, but we'd have to research it to know. So there's so many of these questions that you're mentioning, and I'm trying to figure out what's the most important question to answer. And for me, I think the biggest question is dosage. And so I think if I did another study, I would probably take a bunch of people and modulate the dose with lots of different increments, maybe the lowest being 0.5 milligrams a day and maybe the upper being 9, and see, can we quickly get someone to the optimal dose? What does that range look like? And can we predict what person needs what dose? And I think that would get us a long way to making this really clinically beneficial, because a lot of physicians don't have time to do little 0.5 milligram increments all the time, look at response, adjust it, and it's hard to do to have a bunch of different dosages prepared. So that would be a good thing to answer, and then maybe we could look at more than once a day dosing. So I would consider it. It's probably not something the National Institutes of Health, which fund most of my research, would want to do. But, if we did gather funding for that, I think it's interesting enough to try.
Another interesting point that I've noticed over the years, and I've been doing this 13 years, and we do surveys every now and then. And from one of the surveys we did, we were trying to find out if height and weight, female, had an effect on the dose of what our members were taking. And it was really interesting that most of the men would seem as though 3 milligrams was their optimum. When they went over, they didn't feel as good. Women could get to 4.5. And then the height-weight ratio, it seems as though the men who couldn't tolerate a very big dose were like rugby players, 6'6", you know, really, really big, heavy. And then there was, 5 foot nothing little lady, very, very slim, who could take 4.5. I mean, have you noticed in any of the studies that you have done the difference between male and female, a heavy person, a light person? Does that have a bearing on the dosing?
Yeah, we've really restricted our studies to women because it's harder to get the number of men needed to get the information you need to do the statistical analysis. But it would not surprise me at all. I with as low of a dose as we use with low-dose naltrexone, it's probably not the case that, generally with drugs, you have a larger BMI. If you have more body weight, that's more tissue that the drug has to get to. And so bigger, you need a bigger dose. I just don't think that applies with low-dose naltrexone. I think it's more about I think you'd have to look at someone's genetics to know the density of mu-opioid receptors and the responsivity of those receptors. So I think there are predictors, but I do think you would have to do genetic analysis to get at it rather than looking at BMI. Now, men versus women, men and women's opioid systems are completely different. They respond to even opioid painkillers in drastically different ways. In fact, just like you said, men actually get a better benefit from lower doses of opioids than women. Women need a higher opioid dosage to get the same analgesic benefit, even though they're smaller. And that's differences in the opioid system. So it doesn't surprise me at all that you reverse that and use naltrexone. It's still engaging the opioid system. You get the same thing.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I'd like to ask you the $1 million question that I know many of these listeners would like to ask. Some doctors say that Tramadol is a synthetic opioid and not really an opiate and can be taken with LDN, where others will say, no, it's still an opiate, still works on the same receptors and it can't be taken. Scientifically, could LDN be taken with Tramadol?
Yeah. So Tramadol is unique because it hits, there's more than one. Mu is one of at least 3 different opioid receptors, and so delta and kappa are some other receptors, and there's actually some other opioid-related receptors. So Tramadol has a different mixture of receptor affinity. However, it does have mu opioid receptor activity. That's without question. I mean, it does have some typical opioid activity. And so if you block those receptors, we don't know what that would do with Tramadol. Of all the opioids, the risk of naltrexone blocking it is probably the lowest with Tramadol. So if I were really to guess and someone said, I'm taking a low dosage of Tramadol, what happens if I take naltrexone? And I had to guess, I would say they would probably be okay. They would probably not go into acute withdrawal, which is the fear with taking naltrexone and a proper opioid. Beyond that, when you're taking a real low dose of naltrexone, it doesn't do a great job at blocking receptors for a very long period of time. So it may also be the case that you can take other opioids with LDN. I haven't gotten enough information from physicians to get their experiences. I know some people are really sensitive, and so they would conflict, but I think other people, they wouldn't interact in a negative way. So with Tramadol, I think if someone's on a steady level of Tramadol, they would have to check with their physician. But if I was talking to a physician, I would say, okay, keep the Tramadol level and introduce a very low dose of LDN. So start at like 0.5, super, super low. That way, even if there is an interaction, the person may feel just a little anxious and it'll go away after an hour or two, and just see what happens if they're interested in that. I would say in most cases, those two things will probably coexist without a problem. But yeah, to be absolutely sure, we'd have to do that study. So if that's what people really want to know, that would be a separate type of study. Actually take people who have fibromyalgia or another chronic pain disorder who are on Tramadol from their physician, enroll them in an LDN study and start them at really low, increase it, and just monitor them closely and see what happens. So that's the big question. We might could do that on 20 people and just find out and answer that question.
Well, it's interesting. What other questions?
We should have a vote. We'll say,
yes.
Here's the 10 studies we can do. If everyone gets the most vote, we'll do a pilot study and let you know what happened.
Well, we could do that. That is a thought.
We might could. Let's get a little bit of pilot money.
So, what questions would you say are commonly asked that we haven't covered?
Just regarding LDN. So we definitely have the big ones. How
about side effects?
Really difficult.
Side effects.
Yeah. So in our published studies, the side effects were quite minimal. But as we're hearing, with the study, you get a very homogeneous sample. So we have a very restrictive age range. For statistical reasons, you want people to be very similar, so their side effects are going to be more similar. When physicians start using it, they use it on a much broader range of participant demographics and other medications, and so you get more side effects. So I can say from our research, the only side effect that rose above chance was more vivid dreams. That was it. There was nothing else. There were other things reported, but they were reported with placebo as well. And they weren't more common in low-dose naltrexone than placebo, so we can't attribute it to the drug. Now, I don't believe that more vivid dreams is the only thing that's attributable to naltrexone. It just, with our sample, that's all we identified. So, I hear from, some people have an mild anxiety reaction. I think there are people who have a very, very sensitive opioid system, and it's actually it's blocking their own endogenous opioids, and it's causing like a mini withdrawal. That's possible. And then the sleep, I think the biggest thing is the sleep. So I think for most people that's transient, and so they may have insomnia for 2-3 weeks. I guess for some people it goes longer, but the more vivid dreams and the insomnia I think are definitely going to be the most common side effects. But everyone is different, and even if 1,000 people can take it with very minimal problem, one person can take it and have allergic reaction or have dizziness, or it can really upset their stomach. So, if someone thinks they have a side effect that started because of this drug, you got to take that seriously because, we're all different. So, yeah, to get side effects, you have to do huge studies. You need to run hundreds and hundreds of people to know for sure. And I hope that's what the companies that are now trying to market LDN, I hope they're doing that and can report on the full side effect, because the FDA here in America will want to see that information. And then the interactions, people want to know, does it interact with these other drugs? And then the big question is, everyone's like, I have this disease or this disease or this disease. Will LDN work for me? And again, we'd have to do the studies to know that. So unfortunately, most of the questions I get, my answer is we have to do a research study. I don't want to guess, but I do think low-dose naltrexone is, so far it looks so safe that as long as someone's physician is monitoring, I think it's no big harm having them try it just for 2-3 months and see if something good happens.
Okay. Well, we'll just now go to a break and we'll be back in a minute. Murray Avenue Apothecary is a compounding pharmacy boutique specialising in gentle hormone restoration therapy, acetyl glutathione, pet compounding, lab naturals non-toxic skincare, hair restoration, one-to-one consultations and more. They are Pittsburgh's only green pharmacy and proud compounder of LDN therapies through the LDN Trust. Learn more at maapgh.com. Welcome back. Okay. Could you tell us what other studies you've done with LDN? I understand you're doing one at the moment with chronic fatigue syndrome. Is that right?
Yes. So That's another big question we get is, I think we clearly showed that it works well if you have fibromyalgia. Most of the people we study with fibromyalgia also meet criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome, but in those studies it looked like it was impacting pain better than fatigue, but we can't really interpret that because the individuals we put in those studies, their pain was much worse than their fatigue. So they were predominantly, their debilitation was driven by pain. And so since their fatigue levels were lower, there's not as much room for fatigue to move. So the big question is, okay, if it works for fibromyalgia, does it work for people who have chronic fatigue syndrome but do not have fibromyalgia? Does it work specifically on fatigue, or does it only help fatigue because it improves pain, and if your pain's lower, you can sleep better, and so then your fatigue gets better? So we want to know if it has a direct impact on fatigue. Huge question. We get asked that all the time. So we'll do a clinical trial, which we've already started. I think Dr. Luke Parkitney, who's heading it up, has already screened some people. And the question there is we look at both. Some people will get placebo at different times. They don't know when. Some people may get LDN the whole time. And so we can look at what happens when you go on LDN, what happens when you come off, what happens when you take it for a super long time. Does the effect last, or does it kind of weaken over time? So right now we're trying to recruit for that study, and pretty straightforward. We'll run about 30 people, and by the end of that study, we should be able to say pretty definitively if it looks like LDN is going to impact specifically ME/CFS fatigue.
Mm-hmm. We have actually got a caller here who would like to ask you a question, and it's Tam who wants... Hello, are you there, Tam?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay. What question would
Can you hear me?
Yes. What question would you like to ask Dr. Jarrad Younger?
Well, you were talking about opioids with LDN, and my question is I've heard some conflicting information about prednisone, that you should not be on more than 20 milligrams of prednisone along with LDN, and then also methotrexate with LDN, since, it decreases the immune system and then LDN modulates it. What's his opinion on the use of those two drugs, which is what they're wanting me to use for my condition?
Yeah, very good. So again, the general caveat applies, which is if we haven't studied it, we can't know absolutely for sure. I do understand the theoretical risk of those. Definitely the two drugs you mentioned are powerful. They are powerful modulators of the immune system, and we think that naltrexone is also modulating the immune system. In some ways we know, and in some ways we probably don't. So those drugs you mentioned would be ones where I would be, I think they're higher risk combinations. So basically that would apply to anything that's modulating the immune system. That does not mean, I have not seen information specifically showing that there is a risk of taking those two things at the same time. However, the theoretical risk is high enough where I would be hesitant to try it unless necessary. So is the situation being on these drugs and then adding LDN, or we're talking about like you were on LDN and now physicians want to add prednisone or methotrexate?
Well, I started LDN, and literally because I was newly diagnosed with Sjogren's syndrome, and also it was actually prescribed for Hashimoto's. But the very first day I took LDN, it stopped my neuropathy, and I haven't had it since. But then about a month later, I got diagnosed with the Sjogren's, and they had to start me on prednisone, which I only tolerated 20 milligrams. So I did take them concurrently, and I took obviously the prednisone first thing in the morning and LDN at night. But so I did that for 8 months, and I weaned off, and I'm flaring now, and they want me to do methotrexate, and I'm having to take some prednisone to just get this flare under control, because I have they call it a multifocal inflammatory myositis as a complication of the Sjogren's. So, so I just I'm kind of torn whether to take methotrexate. So, because I also have the MTHFR gene, so I don't know what to do.
Yeah, and again, that's where just having a really good on-the-ball physician who can monitor that, because there's not enough theoretical basic science evidence and not enough clinical evidence to answer that question. So using that in combination would be truly experimental. I can't, again, I haven't had information to suggest that it's dangerous, but it is something that would have to be closely monitored. But I wouldn't say that you can't do that, but you would be on the lookout for anything that indicates over suppression of the immune system. So if you start having more infectious diseases, then you may need to try to take away one or the other and see if that helps that situation. So unfortunately, there's not an easy answer to that.
Well, I appreciate that. That's good to know, because my physician doesn't even really, he's a rheumatologist, doesn't even believe in LDN, and I came to him on it. And even though I tell him that literally it stopped my neuropathy the first day, he doesn't prescribe it, and he just kind of pats my head and says, that's good, that it's working
It'll
for
take a while. What will change that is once one of these companies, and I don't know what stage they're at, but once they come up with, and some of them already have names for it, come out with a low-dose formulation, and it is FDA approved, all that physician skepticism, or a lot of it, will change very quickly, because that FDA, here in the U.S., the FDA seal of approval means a whole lot. So it means it's gone through a bunch of steps to get there. So I do think that's going to change at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Okay. Well, great. And while I'm on the phone, have you done any research with LDN and IV R-alpha-lipoic acid? Have you?
Have used that combination at all. It's interesting.
Okay.
I've not studied it, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, there's so many questions, so many interesting combinations, and a lot of them make a lot of sense, and I keep thinking, I wish we could study that. I wish we had time to study that. So we really have to rely on physicians, because they're the ones that have the flexibility to try different things. And so I think really what I would like to see is a way for physicians who treat a lot of fibromyalgia patients and autoimmune patients and other inflammatory patients, chronic diseases, to find a way for them to systematically report how their patients respond, because they can try stuff that would take me years and years to try, because when I want to test a combination of like Naltrexone and something else, I've got to get it approved by an IRB, I've got to get grant funding for it, and these physicians are running these experiments every day. And so the information potential is huge, and I think some of the nonprofit companies can help with that as well through surveys. But the physicians and the patients, they have way, way more information than the scientists do at this point, because I don't know, what are the estimates, number of people taking low-dose naltrexone? I mean, it's a very large number. And so if we could just capture that data and find out what information they're providing, we could we could make some major advances. I just don't know how to harness that information and get that from them and bring it together in a good way.
Okay.
If somebody figures that out, we can talk.
How about, could we implement something with the LDN app, do you think?
Which is right now designed for patients specifically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking about the doctors reporting. Or, I'm just trying to think out loud. I know hundreds of LDN prescribers. I mean, if we were to put together some kind of a survey with your help and got this out to all the doctors for them to fill in on their patients, would that report back to you with the findings?
It would. They wouldn't have the time to do it, though. What they would need to do is go through the medical records, and they would have to, because what we want to see is what happened before, during low-dose naltrexone. So it would take a lot of work to pull down medical records. But it is true what you mentioned before, is that the patients have that information as well. I mean, they know what their day-to-day life is like, as long as they remember, can track. It's kind of hard to go back retrospectively, but what would be nice is if a physician, it wouldn't take much work on their part, but if they said to every patient they're about to give low-dose naltrexone to, hey, I'm about to give you this prescription, so what I want you to do is download this app, go to this website, start tracking your symptoms, and then indicate when you take low-dose naltrexone, and we can use that in research. So if they could just refer the patient, the physician wouldn't have to do a lot of work. We just need to get people before they actually started to get the most information.
Yes. Well, that's what we were trying to do. We had a campaign all last year, sometime October time, where we were asking doctors who are prescribers before they prescribed LDN to get the patients to use the app, exactly what you were saying. So there was a baseline. This is what they were like before they started. This was what they were like, 1 week, 2 weeks, and you can do graphs and charts and things. So maybe we ought to have another go at getting more people to take part. There are several hundred who are using it regularly, but I have to have another look at that.
If you have several hundred, that beats all the low-dose naltrexone studies to date collectively. So if it's done correctly, that can be a very great kind of supplemental source of information. If it's done really well, that can be published in the scientific literature. It's because we're really interested in pragmatic clinical trial designs. It's kind of a buzzword in clinical medicine. It means you, instead of having these laboratory-based clinical trials, you go out and study people who are taking the drug through their physician, because the cost is basically nothing, and you still get great information. You lose experimental control, but you gain this kind of real-world element that may be more important. So, definitely could help out with that if you try it again.
That would be good. We actually have 2 research people who have papers published who has submitted to somebody. When I say body, not a body, but for actually that, to get approval for the app. But I'll discuss that with you later. My husband's just given me a piece of paper here, and not only do we this evening have people from America listening and England, but we've got Germany, Australia and New Zealand as well, and we had some people with other places in Europe, so that's quite amazing. Well, we're nearly at the end. It's been so interesting. Still didn't manage to ask you all these questions that had come in. We have touched on a few of them. And we've got the conference coming up later this year. I think we'll have to have you back, Jarrad, so you can talk about other studies that you've done with LDN, because you are the nearest that we've got really to the fibromyalgia. Jill Smith has done the Crohn studies, but she used steroids, didn't she, in conjunction with using LDN in her studies?
In her Crohn's disease?
Yes.
I didn't catch that in the clinical trials. They might have been patients with that were already on steroids for the Crohn's disease. She might have done it as an kind of a conjunctive or additive kind of medication, but I actually didn't have that in my mind. She did that. I'd have to go back and check to be sure.
I believe she did. Yeah.
Okay. And we're actually, we've got some grant applications in, so maybe working with her more in the future if the federal government decides to fund our study ideas. We'll see.
Do you think one day we'll get an MS study? What do you think?
Yes, we're going to try again. I think I always have to be careful what I'm allowed to talk about. I can say this. We tried to get Department of Defense funding for an MS-LDN study. We talked about that before about a year ago. That was not approved. We don't know why, because this particular mechanism, they don't give feedback. So we're just going to try again this year, and we'll put the application back in. We'll try to look over and see where maybe it was just they didn't have enough funding, so maybe they would fund it this time. So we're going to put that back in, and hopefully next year, if it's approved, we can actually do it, because it was a straight MS clinical trial, quite large, and the DoD, Department of Defense, is interested in funding multiple sclerosis clinical research. So, yep, we'll definitely try.
Lovely. Well, we'll have to end it here, and thank you very much for being with us today, Jarrad. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Murray Avenue Apothecary is a compounding pharmacy boutique specialising in gentle hormone restoration therapy, acetyl glutathione, pet compounding, Lab Naturals non-toxic skincare, hair restoration, one-to-one consultations and more. They are Pittsburgh's only green pharmacy and proud compounder of LDN therapies through the LDN Trust. Learn more at maapgh.com.
Any questions or comments you may have, please email me, Linda, Linda, at ldnrt.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated your company. Until next time, stay safe and keep well.